Nick's okay, very good. Delighted to welcome you all to the Jewish Historical Society of Ireland. And our title today is Lieutenant Colonel John Henry Patterson, the Irish Protestant Zionist, which sounds a very odd combination, the Godfather of the Israeli army. A couple of months ago I gave a talk here about the RAF and the petrol that the RAF planes used in their bombing raids on Germany, and I made a claim in the title that on every gallon of petrol used in RAF planes, royalties were paid to Nazi Germany. I hope I substantiated that claim, but one member of the audience who can't be with us today because, unlike you guys, they've just flown to America. So I hope to substantiate this title. We are in 1896, and the British started building something called the Uganda Railway, also known as the Lunatic Express, a 660-mile rail line from the port city of Mombasa to the eastern shore of Lake Victoria in what is today Kenya, what was then Uganda. A couple of years later, 1898, the line had reached the river Tsavo, and a soldier with engineering experience was seconded by the British Army in India to supervise 3,000 labourers, many of them from India, a lot of them local, to build a railway bridge over the river Tsavo. This was a big engineering project, and it needed a lot of people. And that soldier was John Henry Patterson. Soon after arriving in Tsavo, Patterson discovered that two maneless male man-eating lions were stalking the campsite at night while the labourers slept, dragging Indian workers from their tents and having them for supper. Patterson built campfires and thorn fences around the camp to keep the man-eaters out, but they either leapt over or crawled under the thorn fences. Hundreds of workers fled, and construction on the bridge came to a halt. The lions earned the dubious privilege of being the subject of a parliamentary debate in London. Prime Minister Lord Salisbury told the House of Lords the whole of the works were put to a stop for 3 weeks because a party of man-eating lions appeared in the locality and conceived a most unfortunate taste for our porters. Patterson tried several times to ambush the lions at night from a tree platform. Eventually, he shot the first lion in the back leg. However, the lion escaped and began stalking Patterson as he tried to hunt it. He shot it through the shoulder, penetrating its heart with a bullet, and Patterson found the lion lying dead the next morning not far from his platform. 20 days later, the second lion was found and killed. The construction crew returned and completed the bridge in February 1899. Just as a side story, just a few years later, the bridge was demolished when the German army came through town, trying to stake its own claim in Africa. And the book that Patterson wrote about these adventures, called The Man-Eaters of Tsavo, became an international bestseller and is still in print today, 100 and something years later. After earning the DSO, that's the Distinguished Service Order, in the Boer War, Patterson had some further adventures in the African bush before turning up in Egypt in early 1915. Like many other officers, he was anxious to get a commission to fight in the First World War, which had broken out in July 1914. And there were quite a few of these non-commissioned officers hanging around in Egypt, waiting for a commission to go and fight. In 4 days' time, on the 22nd of March, we will mark the 100th anniversary of an event that caused almost zero ripples around the world at the time. This event, the creation of the Zion Mule Corps in Egypt, is now recognized as one of the defining moments in Jewish history. And one special feature of the Zion Mule Corps is that this was the first Jewish fighting unit in almost 2,000 years. The last one probably being the Bar Kokhba army in the 2nd century. And another special feature is that the British officer appointed to command the Zion Mule Corps was none other than Lieutenant Colonel John Henry Patterson, Irishman, Christian, Zionist, and lion killer. Born in 1867 in Ballymahon, County Longford, Patterson had a deep knowledge of the Hebrew Bible, and I quote, "From the days of my youth, I spent the greater part of my leisure hours poring over the Bible." We will return to Patterson shortly. No sign of Rodney yet?
I don't know, he's disappeared.
Okay.
Searching for the parking.
Because I'm about to mention a member of the audience who is still parking the car. I will carry on and I will read this in a special reading, like doing the Megillah. I'll do a special reading for him later. Just over 10 years ago, I was invited to give a talk about Patterson to the Military History Society of Ireland. One of the people in the audience, Rodney Stafford, Catherine's Rodney, had received instructions to attend my talk from his friend Kelvin Crombie in Jerusalem. So someone in Jerusalem contacts somebody in Wicklow and says to him, go and attend a talk in Dublin, given by a guy from Dundalk. So I'm delighted that Rodney will shortly be with us this evening. I'm also delighted that his wife Catherine is with us too. Catherine helps me to run the Jewish Historical Society of Ireland. And through the Staffords, I met Kelvin Crombie, who inspired me to write the first of 3 books on Gentiles who helped the Jews come home. The decision of the Ottoman Empire, that's Turkey, to join World War I on the side of Germany, after having been neutral for a few months, had an immediate impact on 2 Russian-born Jewish Zionists. The first was Ze'ev Vladimir Jabotinsky, a journalist for a Russian newspaper. He was on assignment in France when he learned that his native Odessa had been shelled by German ships attached to the Turkish fleet on the 29th of October 1914, marking Turkey's entry into the war on Germany's side. Jabotinsky noted in his diary, "I must confess, until that morning in Bordeaux, as everywhere else, I'd been a mere observer without any particular reasons for wishing full triumph to one side and crushing disaster to the other. Turkey's move transformed me in one short morning into a fanatical believer in victory of the Allies. Realizing that the Turks would never grant the Jews the autonomous status that they were seeking in Palestine, Jabotinsky knew that for Zionism to triumph, the Jews needed to fight the Turks." Hello, Rodney. You've just missed an honourable mention. I'm just going to repeat that sentence. I'm delighted that Rodney is with us this evening. And I told the story of how you came to watch me talk to the Military History Society of Ireland, which actually got me started on my Patterson journey. So Jabotinsky realized that this was a unique opportunity for Jews to demand their historical national rights. He persuaded his newspaper to send him to North Africa to report on the reactions to the Turkish Sultan's call for the world's Muslims to back Turkey in its jihad against Britain and its allies. It's very interesting in the light of what's happening today in the world that in 1914, just after Turkey entered the war, the Sultan, who was regarded as the representative of Muslims on earth, issued a jihad and saying that anyone who fights on the side of the Allies against Germany is going against the word of Allah, of Islam. So not much has changed. The second Russian Jew was Joseph Trumpeldor, the most decorated Jewish soldier in the Tsarist army. He was the hero of Port Arthur during the now largely forgotten 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War, and Trumpeldor became the first Jew in the Russian army to receive an officer's commission. Imagine that. Prior to the revolution, Jews could never become officers in the Tsarist Russian army. But because he was this multi-decorated hero of Port Arthur, he was the only person to be so decorated. And Trumpeldor was so enamored with the Russian regime that he made Aliyah to Palestine in 1911, from where he was expelled by the Turks, along with thousands of other Russian Jews, for refusing to become Turkish citizens and refusing to fight for the Ottoman army. Warships supplied by neutral America took the Jewish refugees from Jaffa to Egypt, where they were housed by the British in the Mafruza barracks in Alexandria. And it's in Alexandria, in the barracks, where Trumpeldor and Jabotinsky meet for the first time. And they started promoting the idea of a Jewish legion that would fight on the side of the Allies to liberate Palestine from the Ottoman Empire. Early March 1915, Jabotinsky and Trumpeldor put their proposals to a meeting of hundreds of Jewish refugees. And at a further meeting on the 13th of March 1915, just over 100 years ago, 180 people signed a 7-line resolution written in Hebrew on a page torn from an exercise book, and that piece of paper is today in Israel's National Library. Jabotinsky and Trumpeldor were deputized to present the resolution to the British War Office minister in Cairo. He sent them to the commander-in-chief of the British forces in Egypt, but he pooh-poohed the idea of any offensive towards Palestine, adding, "Under the law, I am not entitled to accept foreigners into the British Army. I can offer you only one thing, to form a corps de muleteers, a mule transport unit, from your young people and send it to any other Turkish front." This transport unit would be sent to Gallipoli. Because Jabotinsky had imagined a substantial fighting force joining in the conquest of Palestine, he rejected the proposal. He even objected to the name. And in Hebrew he said, "Yehudim v'chamorim ze lo holech yachad bo'oto mishpat," which means Jews and mules do not belong together in the same sentence. Trumpeldor had a more pragmatic approach, and he said, "From a soldier's perspective, in order to liberate Palestine, we have to destroy the Turks. And whether we beat them from the north or the south is a technical question. Each front leads to Zion." The two friends agreed to differ. Trumpeldor told a recruitment meeting in Mafruza, "A new and bright era rises for our people, an era which will enable us to fulfill the dream and vision of our prophets and our own vision of redeeming our land from the hands of strangers and to rebuild it." Major General Sir Alexander John Godley told the refugees that the proposed corps represented a unique historical event. He said, "Today the English people have entered into a covenant with the Jewish people. And to reinforce his argument, Godley invited a fellow British officer to address the meeting. This officer forcefully argued that soldiers who carry ammunition and supplies to the trenches require no less courage than the men who fire their rifles. And that this fellow officer was John Henry Patterson. When the British commander in Egypt searched for a British non-commissioned officer in Alexandria to command the Jewish corps, Godley suggested Patterson. In the light of Patterson's positive response, which I will read in a moment, I'm tempted to add, God suggested Patterson. Listen to how Patterson later described the moment. It is curious that the commander-in-chief in Egypt should have chosen me, because he knew nothing of my knowledge of Jewish history and my sympathy for the Jewish race. When as a boy I eagerly devoured the records of the glorious deeds of Jewish military captains such as Joshua, Joab, Gideon, Judas Maccabee, I never dreamt that in a small way I would become a captain of a host of the children of Israel. It was strange, therefore, that I, so imbued with the Jewish traditions, should have arrived in Egypt at the psychological moment when the army was looking for a suitable officer to recruit a Jewish unit. 22nd of March, 1915, that's 4 days' time, 100 years ago, Patterson took command of the Assyrian Jewish Refugee Mule Corps, which was such a mouthful that it very quickly became known as the Zion Mule Corps. Trumpeldor became his deputy. Recruitment began in earnest, and on the 31st of March, the first 500 volunteers were sworn in and embarked on an intensive 3-week training period. On the 2nd of April 1915, Patterson wrote in his diary, "Never since the days of Judah Maccabee had such sights and sounds been seen and heard in a military camp with the drilling of uniformed soldiers in the Hebrew language." Since Patterson spoke neither Hebrew nor Yiddish nor Russian, I have a suspicion that he wasn't hearing Hebrew at all, but I'm not going to argue with him, because these were all Russian Jews. On the 17th of April 1915, the Corps marched to Alexandria's Great Synagogue on Nabi Daniel Street, that's Nabi Daniel, Daniel the Prophet Street, cheered by the local Jewish population. The chief rabbi described Patterson as a second Moses, leading the children of Israel from Egypt to the Promised Land. Patterson told his troops, "Pray with me that I should not only, as Moses, behold Canaan from afar, but be divinely permitted to lead you into the Promised Land." The Zion Mule Corps sailed to Gallipoli, arriving under heavy enemy fire. Patterson described how his men fared. "I watched my men very carefully to see how they would stand their baptism of fire, and I'm glad to be able to say that all appeared quite unconcerned and took not the slightest heed of the dangerous position they were in." In late November 1915, Patterson fell ill and was sent back home to London to convalesce. When all Allied troops were evacuated from Gallipoli the following month, Trumpeldor addressed the last parade of the Zion Mule Corps in Hebrew. "We are leaving tonight. Our work is done. We have a right to say, well done. We and the Jewish people need never be ashamed of the Zion Mule Corps." In the Gallipoli campaign, 14 men of the Zion Mule Corps had been killed and over 60 wounded. 26th of May 1916, just 13 months after it was raised, the Zion Mule Corps was finally and formally disbanded. In the meantime, Jabotinsky, who didn't want anything to do with a mule corps and that was populated by Jews, had changed his mind and now recognized the PR value of the Zion Mule Corps. And he wrote, "It was that donkey battalion from Alexandria, ridiculed by all wits in Israel, which opened before me the doors of the government offices in Whitehall, where he was still trying to get the British government to raise a Jewish legion. However, he failed to interest other Allied governments in supporting this proposal. And although his friend, Zionist leader and future first president of the State of Israel, Chaim Weizmann, was sympathetic, he followed the Zionist official policy of outward neutrality, since so many Jews were also fighting on the German side. And in fact, the 1915 Congress of the World Zionist Organization in Copenhagen passed a resolution condemning any attempt to form a Jewish legion in England for the conquest of Palestine. Jabotinsky was not to be thwarted, and he managed to secure a meeting with Field Marshal Lord Kitchener, the British Secretary of War, who totally rejected the idea. In early June 1916, Jabotinsky received a note from Patterson, the commander of the now disbanded Zion Mule Corps, who was still recuperating in a London hospital. Jabotinsky and Patterson had never met, but they corresponded. And Patterson had been following Jabotinsky's efforts to form a Jewish legion. When the two met in Patterson's hospital room, Patterson told Jabotinsky, "The commanding officer of the Australian and New Zealand Expeditionary Force, General Birdwood, thought a Jewish legion was a great idea. Nothing would give me greater gratification than to raise, train, and command a Jewish fighting unit." And this meeting marked the start of a powerful and lasting alliance between the two men. After Lord Kitchener, the enemy of the Jewish Legion, drowned while on a mission to Russia, Patterson introduced Jabotinsky to Captain Leopold Amery, a champion of the cause of a Jewish legion. Amery, who was later to become one of the people who drafted the Balfour Declaration, enjoyed direct access to the British cabinet. In July 1916, Trumpeldor and 120 members of the recently disbanded Zion Mule Corps reached the London barracks. Patterson and Amery lobbied hard to ensure that the muleteers were assigned to the same unit, the 20th Battalion, London Regiment, stationed in Hazley Downs near Winchester. And Jabotinsky took the very unusual step of enlisting in the same regiment as a private. To the best of my knowledge, he was the only Jewish leader in Britain, Zionist leader, to volunteer to join the British Army in the First World War. His commanding officers were bemused, to say the least, at the sight of senior army officers descending on Hazley Downs to discuss military matters with Private Jabotinsky. At Amery's suggestion, Jabotinsky wrote a detailed proposal for the War Cabinet and Prime Minister, including details of Jabotinsky's previous efforts to form a special Jewish corps. The proposal was signed by Jabotinsky and Trumpeldor, and Amery personally handed this proposal to Prime Minister Lloyd George. In April 1917, Amery was able to inform Jabotinsky, "Your affair is really making progress at last." A few days later, while Private Jabotinsky was on Passover leave in London, a War Office messenger brought him a handwritten note ordering him to report to Lord Derby at the War Office. Jabotinsky took Trumpeldor along to the meeting, where the formalities of a regimental uniform and identifying badge as a Jewish unit were discussed. And on August 23rd, 1917, the creation of the Jewish Regiment was officially announced in the London Gazette. When the British Army authorities asked Jabotinsky's advice, this is still Private Jabotinsky, and they're asking Private Jabotinsky who should command the Jewish Legion, he naturally suggested Patterson. Jabotinsky himself was appointed as deputy commander, holding the honorary rank of lieutenant in charge of recruitment. Not surprisingly, He soon became known among the British sergeants as Lieutenant Jugger-Whiskey. Amazingly, the British would not accept Trumpeldor into the Jewish Legion because he only had one arm. Well, duh. He had only one arm when he was the deputy commander of the Zion Mule Corps. But anyway, so he was out. He was no longer part of the picture. The enthusiastic crowds that had cheered on the British troops in the early days of World War I had long since evaporated. We've all seen newsreels of cheering crowds, not just in Britain, but in Britain people were out in the streets and bands were playing as people signed up. But that was no longer, of course, that we're now in 4 years into the war, and this is just not happening anymore. And yet, on February the 4th, 1918, a very unusual event took place in London. Large crowds were on the streets of the Jewish quarter of Whitechapel to watch Patterson ride at the head of 426 men with 12 officers of the 38th Battalion Royal Fusiliers through the City of London. The Lord Mayor of London, in his official regalia, received the salute of the Jewish soldiers. And the Jewish Legion received an emotional and tumultuous welcome from the London Jewish crowds. The Jewish Chronicle reported, thousands of Jews and Jewesses marched merrily together with the Judeans from the tower whence the march began, after they had been addressed by Colonel Patterson, who rode at the head of the picturesque Jewish troops. Patterson himself later wrote, "This march of the Jewish soldiers, unique in English history, proved a brilliant success. The scenes of enthusiasm rocked with fervour. The people roared to welcome their own, and Jewish banners hung everywhere." Patterson and his troops arrived in Egypt for training on March the 1st, 1918, and were warmly welcomed by the elders of the Alexandria Jewish community, who said to them, "The Zion Mule Corps was our son, the Jewish Legion is our grandson." The Zion Mule Corps the Jewish Legion arrived in Egypt just before Passover, when Jews recount the story of the Exodus from Egypt. And the departure of the Jewish Legion for Palestine in June 1918 was a sort of reenactment of the Exodus story that had taken place 3,500 years earlier. And Patterson was acutely aware of this parallel. And he told his troops that they were at last fulfilling the ancient Jewish wish of returning to their land. Trumpets sounded and the Reverend Leiber Falk recited a Hebrew blessing. And Patterson even found a biblical analogy in the sparks and flames from the train engine pulling their troop carriages. He reminded his Jewish troops that the children of Israel had been led by a pillar of fire in the same Sinai desert. Amazing, isn't it? And as Patterson led his troops into Palestine, Jabotinsky's vision of a Jewish army fighting for Jewish independence on Jewish soil was finally being realized. September the 19th, 1918, General Allenby began a sustained British attack to finally push the Turks out of all of Palestine and neighboring countries. Patterson's order of the day in Hebrew declared that the Jewish Legion now has the singular honor of going into battle to fight side by side with British comrades. And so they did. On September the 23rd, 1918, Jabotinsky led his company across the Jordan River at el-Shert in pursuit of the Turkish army, at the precise point where Joshua led the victorious Israelites into the Promised Land. Read your Bible, you'll know that the children of Israel did not cross into the Promised Land until Moses died. Joshua becomes the leader, and that is the same spot where he crossed into the Promised Land. And in a highly symbolic gesture, the officers and men waited until Jabotinsky's foot touched the soil on the east bank of the river before they advanced. By the time World War I ended a few weeks later, some 5,000 members of the 10,000-strong Jewish Legion had served in Palestine. At a ceremony in 1919, described by Patterson as one of the proudest days in his life, the New Zealand General Chaytor decorated several Jewish legionnaires at Rafah. Chaytor told Patterson's legionnaires, "By your gallant capture of the Shert ford and defeat of the Turkish rearguard, I was enabled to push my mounted men over the Jordan, and so you contributed materially to the capture of Es-Salt and Amman, the cutting of the Hejaz railway, and the destruction of the 4th Turkish army, which helped considerably towards the great victory won at Damascus." Jabotinsky and Patterson had always envisaged that the Jewish Legion would be a permanent Jewish garrison in Palestine after the war. General Allenby had other plans. Despite the fact that the British government had issued the Balfour Declaration a year earlier in November 1917, promising a Jewish home in Palestine, Allenby gradually pared the Judean regiment down from 3 battalions to 2 to 1. In April 1919, the British Army authorities placed Jerusalem out of bounds to the legionnaires so that they could not celebrate Passover in the Holy City. An incensed Patterson was later to write, "I cannot perceive a greater act of provocation to Jewish soldiers than this, or a greater insult. Think of it," he said. "Jewish soldiers for the first time in their lives in Palestine and barred from the temple wall of Jerusalem during Passover. Only Jews can really understand what it means to these men." Exasperated at the humiliating treatment of the rump of the Jewish Legion, Jabotinsky finally gave vent to his feelings in a personal letter to General Allenby. And he wrote, "I was the initiator of both the Zion Mule Corps and the actual Jewish battalions. Today, I am forced to witness how my work is breaking into pieces under the intolerable burden of disappointment, despair, broken pledges, and anti-Semitism permeating the whole administration and military atmosphere." Jabotinsky was to pay a very heavy price for this blatant bypassing of the established chain of command. Allenby's response was to order Jabotinsky's immediate demobilization from the ranks of the Legion. And as soon as he was booted out of the Jewish Legion, Jabotinsky joined others to create the Haganah, which included veterans of the Zion Mule Corps, the Jewish Legion, and the Hashomer militias. Jabotinsky openly drilled his men on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. Now, because the date for Easter, as some of you will know, is determined by the lunar and not the solar calendar, it often falls on or close to Passover, which of course is also based entirely on the lunar calendar. And they often fall together, as they will in 2 weeks' time, when the first night of Passover is on Easter Friday. In 1920, Easter, Passover, and the Muslim festival of Nebi Musa, the prophet Moses, all fell in the same week. And the trouble started when a contingent of Hebron Arabs entered Jerusalem via the Jaffa Road. Now, in previous years, the procession had wound round the walls of Jerusalem and entered through the Damascus Gate and on through the Muslim quarter to the Great Mosque. This year, 1920, the police, in their wisdom, diverted the procession through the Jaffa Gate and into the Jewish quarter. No, you can imagine what happened. And the only law enforcers in Jerusalem were an Arab police detachment. And as the revelers reached the city, the Arab mayor of Jerusalem addressed the marchers from a balcony, calling on them to be ready to shed their blood for Palestine. As they say, plus ça change. The Arab police joined in the applause, and many of them joined in the subsequent rioting. And during the next 3 hours, the mob, armed with clubs and knives, went on the rampage. To the accompaniment of cries of "Kill the Jews" and "We shall drink the blood of Jews," the Arab rioters looted shops, attacked, beat, stoned, stabbed, and killed several Jews. When Jabotinsky first heard rumors of the impending riot, he rushed his Haganah members into the old city, but their way was blocked by British Army soldiers manning machine guns at the Jaffa Gate and the Damascus Gate. And by the time the British police and troops finally pushed the rioters back into the mosque, 6 Jews had been killed, 211 murdered, 2 women had been raped, and countless Jewish shops vandalized. Retaliation by Jabotinsky's Haganah left 4 Arab dead and 21 wounded. Who do the British arrest? Jabotinsky, of course, together with 19 of his Haganah comrades. Jabotinsky is tried before a secret military field court and sentenced to 15 years in prison. This is the same Jabotinsky, Lieutenant Jabotinsky, who had only relatively recently left the ranks of the Jewish Legion. And it was also only a few weeks since war hero Joseph Trumpeldor had been killed in Tel Chai. And the Jews of Palestine were absolutely shocked at the severity of Jabotinsky's sentence. The chief rabbi of Jerusalem, Rabbi Abraham Yitzchak Kook, ordered the Jews of Jerusalem to sign petitions in all synagogues for the release of Jabotinsky and his comrades. Patterson was disgusted at Jabotinsky's treatment, and he wrote, "The whole history of this atrocious outrage is a foul stain on our fair name. Jabotinsky was cast into prison garb, had his hair cropped, and was marched in company with 2 Arabs convicted of rape through places where he was well known as a British officer." Patterson went on to write 2 books about his encounter with the Jewish troops. In 1916, he wrote with the Zionists at Gallipoli about the Zion Mule Corps, and in 1922, he wrote with the Judeans in the Palestine campaign, in which he singled out the general headquarters in Palestine for its unfair treatment of the Jewish Legion. This is what he wrote. "In the face of the Balfour Declaration, certain officials in the Holy Land acted as if this epoch-making declaration were nothing but a scrap of paper. This local anti-Jewish feeling eventually culminated in the Jerusalem Pogrom, where under British rule, murderous native mobs ran riot for nearly 3 days within the walls of the city." And as we know, from that period up to the end of the British mandate 30 years later, this was a pattern that became quite firmly established. Throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, Patterson remained a devoted disciple of Jabotinsky and his revisionist Zionist organization. Here is Patterson writing about the outbreak of World War II. "On the morrow of that memorable day in September 1939, when Neville Chamberlain declared that a state of war existed between Great Britain and Germany, I received a telephone call from Jabotinsky asking me whether I would come to London the same afternoon. It was obvious to me that Jabotinsky would suggest a plan for Jewish national participation in the war." And Patterson was right. Jabotinsky started lobbying for a Jewish army to fight side by side with the Allies against the Nazis, just as he had done in the First World War when he tried to raise a Jewish army to fight side by side with the Allies against Turkey. In order to mobilize President Roosevelt and American public opinion to support a 200,000 strong Jewish army, Jabotinsky sailed to the USA in the spring of 1940. He hoped that his idea of a Jewish army fighting alongside the Allies would appeal to non-Jewish Americans who would then pressure Britain to change its draconian Palestine policy of not letting anybody in. Ignoring opposition from mainstream Zionist circles, Jabotinsky and his followers in New York organized a massive rally in favor of a Jewish army. Over 5,000 people jammed into the Manhattan Opera House, where they were addressed not only by Jabotinsky, but also by his loyal friend and supporter, Colonel John Henry Patterson, who had moved permanently to the USA. In August 1940, Jabotinsky succumbed to a fatal heart attack while reviewing hundreds of excited Beitar teenagers attending a summer camp. Beitar stands for Brit Trumpeldor, the Trumpeldor Covenant, which Jabotinsky had named, of course, in honor of his comrade Trumpeldor. Recalling the occasion, Patterson wrote, Vladimir Jabotinsky's last walk on earth was between the lines of young Beitarim who awaited his rival in Camp Beitar in Hunter, New York. I was not with him during the last hours of his life, but when I heard of it, I could not help saying to myself that if Jabotinsky were to choose the setting for his death, it would have been something after this manner among his faithful young followers of Beitar. Jabotinsky's followers in the USA continued to agitate against Britain's failure to deliver the Zionist agenda. And between 1941 and 1944, Patterson, now in his 70s, conducted an energetic fundraising campaign on behalf of the American Friends of a Jewish Palestine, the AFJP. He addressed enthusiastic audiences, proudly describing the heroism of his Jewish muleteers and legionnaires in World War I. And he never failed to remind his audience of the underlying anti-Semitism of the British. 11 months after Patterson died in California in June 1947, his dream of a Jewish army in an independent Jewish state was finally realized. When the newborn state of Israel was attacked by invading Arab armies, the military ethos carved with love, passion, and professionalism by Patterson, Jabotinsky, Trumpeldor, and others helped pave the way for Israel's victory in the War of Independence. Fast forward to the year 2002. Patterson's grandson, Alan, visited Israel to find out more about his famous grandfather. He knew from his mother that John Henry Patterson had expressed a wish to be buried in the future state of Israel. And after a dozen years of bureaucratic wrangling, an official delegation brought a box containing the ashes of Patterson and his wife from a Los Angeles crematorium to Israel last summer. I was invited by the Prime Minister's office to attend the official reinterment ceremony on December the 4th, and unfortunately, I couldn't make it. Addressing the ceremony, Alan Patterson said that he had thought at first that his grandfather was merely a historical footnote. But on further research, he discovered that a direct line linked his grandfather's Jewish battalions of World War I to the IDF, the Israel Defense Force. In his address, Prime Minister Netanyahu said that Lieutenant Colonel John Henry Patterson was, and I quote, the commander of the first Jewish fighting force in nearly 2 millennia. Patterson, said Netanyahu, had absolute confidence that the Jews would make remarkable soldiers, not adequate soldiers, but remarkable soldiers. And I think he had a lot to do with that. This is still Netanyahu talking. He began with a reconstitution of the ability of the Jews to defend ourselves. Now, as we speak, of course, none of us here know whether or how long Bibi Netanyahu will remain as Prime Minister, which reminds me of an old joke about another Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, incidentally a member of Patterson's Jewish Legion. And this guy comes up to the policeman standing in front of the Tel Aviv home of Ben-Gurion on Ben-Gurion Street. And he said, excuse me, he said, is this the home of Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion? And the policeman said, yes, this is the home of David Ben-Gurion, but he's no longer the Prime Minister. Thank you, the guy says. Next day he turns up again. He says, excuse me, he says, is this the home of David Ben-Gurion, the Prime Minister? And the policeman says, listen, I told you. Yes, this is the home of David Ben-Gurion, but he's no longer the Prime Minister. Thank you, says the guy. Third day, he comes again, and he asks the policeman, excuse me, he says, is this the home of David Ben-Gurion, the Prime Minister? And now the policeman's losing his cool, and he says, listen, I've told you. Yes, this is the home of David Ben-Gurion. He's no longer the Prime Minister. I know, said the guy, I just like hearing it. Ladies and gentlemen, I've just published a completely revised and updated 10th anniversary edition of my original book on Patterson called 6 Officers, 2 Lions and 750 Mules, and it now contains an introduction, a preface from Alan Patterson. In the book, at the time when I first wrote it, I identified John Henry Patterson as the architect of Israel's victory in the War of Independence, and I credited Patterson and others as the creators of a Zionist military ethos, an ethos that began with the formation of the Zion Mule Corps 100 years ago. At the reinterment ceremony in Israel, Netanyahu echoed the sentiments of my book when he described Patterson as the godfather of the Israeli army. So here is a question. Why did Netanyahu take such a personal interest in John Henry Patterson? Why, indeed, did the Netanyahu family in Jerusalem, via Kelvin Crombie, ask me to send a signed copy of my book to them? And the answer is that Patterson was very close with Ben Zion Netanyahu, Bibi's father, at the time when Ben Zion was the executive director of Jabotinsky's revisionist movement in the USA. In other words, after Jabotinsky died, Ben Zion Netanyahu from Palestine was in charge of the revisionist movement in the USA. In March 1946, Ben Zion Netanyahu's wife, Tzela, gave birth to their firstborn son in New York City. And the Netanyahus invited Patterson to be the boy's grandfather at the Brit, at the circumcision. And the boy was named Jonathan in John Patterson's honor. Jonathan in Hebrew is Yonatan. And Patterson gave his godson a silver cup engraved with the words, "To my beloved godson Yonatan," from Lieutenant Colonel John Henry Patterson. Yonatan, in short form, is Yoni. And as some of you might have already guessed, this boy grew up to be Major Yoni Netanyahu, the hero who led the Israel Defense Force mission that rescued nearly 100 hostages from Entebbe in Uganda in 1976. Yoni Netanyahu, brother of Israel's Prime Minister Bibi, was the only casualty among the Israeli soldiers. Before I close, I want to go back to early 1915. As you will recall, Jabotinsky and Trumpeldor met with the British commander-in-chief in Egypt, who appointed Patterson to command the Zion Mule Corps. This commander in Egypt was very unhappy with his Egypt posting. He wanted action on the Western Front, like his mates, and he pestered Prime Minister Asquith to reassign him. His request was finally granted in March 1916. And soon after arriving in London, this officer receives a phone call from Prime Minister Asquith in the middle of Easter. He says, "I want you to go to Ireland to put down a spot of bother," the Prime Minister said to him. And thus it was that General Sir John Grenfell Maxwell sailed up the River Liffey and put down the rising. That's right, the same General Maxwell who appointed John Henry Patterson to command the Zion Mule Corps is the General Maxwell who hanged several of the rising leaders, earning himself the name Bloody Maxwell. Let's finish by returning to Patterson, a godfather twice over. He was the actual godfather of Yoni Netanyahu of Entebbe fame, and he was described by Bibi Netanyahu as the godfather of the Israeli army. And we can draw a direct line from Patterson's Zion Mule Corps and Jewish Legion in World War I, via the Haganah, the Palmach, the Jewish Brigade in World War II, to the victory of the Israel Defense Force in Israel's War of Independence in 1948-49. And I quote Bibi on Patterson at the ceremony in Avichail in Israel last December. "In bringing his ashes to Israel and laying them to rest here, beside the soldiers of the Jewish brigades that he established, we come full circle historically, and we repay a very great debt to one of the heroes of our people, one of the greatest supporters that Zionism, the Jewish people, and the state of Israel ever had, John Henry Patterson. We salute you." Thank you.